David. David.
He's falling in a beautiful swirling pattern.
David.
What is up, everyone? I'm David Wells, and this is the David Wells Podcast. Take two. What is up, everyone? My name is David Wells, and this is the David Wells Experiment. It's funny, I did that a second time because I was like, did I say the David Wells Experiment or the David Wells Podcast? And I didn't want to start like a new Mandela effect, although that would have been fun. But speaking of Mandela effects, though this isn't going to be what the whole episode's about, just an amusing aside, I'm sure that we all know about that Mandela effect, about that movie with Sinbad called Shazam. And it's funny, one of my I did a couple of videos on that movie, and so Shazam allegedly was a piece of lost media, or hidden media I should say, that starred Sinbad as the comedian from the 90s as a genie who helps some kids out. And there are several videos debunking its existence, and there's always people saying like, me and my brother saw that movie when we were kids. It was like one of our favorites. And there's no record of the movie actually existing. So what is a Mandela effect? It's basically when, well, let's talk about the source of the name. I think there's a proper official definition of what a Mandela effect is, or what it's called, but we get the name Mandela effect from when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa back in the day. A lot of people were shocked because they thought, I could have swore I remember hearing that he died years ago, and it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was several people saying they remembered it. More than likely what happened was they heard about somebody vaguely similar, and they just got him confused with somebody else. I know when I was a little kid, I used to get Sandra Bullock and who was that other chick? She was in that movie Hope Floats. Hold on. Or wait a minute, am I getting them? No, Sandra Bullock was in that movie. Mona Lisa Smile, that's the one I'm thinking. Let's see. I feel so dumb for forgetting this name. Oh yeah, when I was a kid, I used to get Sandra Bullock and Julia Roberts confused all the time because they could be in very similar movies. So our brains, they have a habit of when they're not totally sure on a piece of information, they'll kind of fill in the gaps with something that is more solid. Like, and you see this all the time. People will say somebody's name, mispronounce somebody's name, or say someone else's name. And, here's a great example. Sometimes I'll be walking around work and I'll say, is there anything you guys need? Or can I get y'all anything? And like, no, ma'am. And I'm not a ma'am, I'm a guy. And then they'll catch it. And That's a simple one because they're probably so much more used to saying no ma'am that, they don't correct the information. So now I hear all kinds of theories about the movie Shazam and how Sinbad was embarrassed by it, even though the man himself has gone on record saying that he never made such a movie. Here's the kicker. There was people who are familiar with this Mandela effect are also familiar with the movie Kazam, which starred Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball player. And in that movie, he played a genie that helped some random kid, as was often the case with these movies from the 90s. Now, here's the thing that. So I think it's a really easy thing. I said this wasn't going to be what the episode was about, and yet here we are 6 minutes into the video and I'm talking about it still. Here's the thing. I think one of the reasons why it was so easy for people to think that Sinbad was in a genie movie in the 90s was because if you look at his outfits, they're kind of crazy looking, and he kind of looks like he could dress like a genie. He has those kind of Arabian Night type of MC Hammer pants. And even his name, Sinbad, it's like the name just sounds like an old mythological name. But I think I found out the solution why people have made this a thing. So on the VHS tape of Kazam, now remember, Kazam is the real genie movie that starred Shaquille O'Neal. There's a trailer for a Sinbad film, First Kid, in which he plays a fumbling Secret Service agent that is supposed to protect the president's 12-year-old son. So it's funny. I think what happened was people saw Kazam, the real movie, didn't find it too memorable, and they saw the trailer for First Kid, which was the Sinbad movie where he's a Secret Service person protecting the president kid. And more people probably saw First Kid than they did Kazam, but they just linked all that together, and that's how we have this thing where we have this fake movie Shazam, and people will. It's so funny that this is a hill that people choose to die on, saying I remember, and they'll say things like, go look it up on the Wayback Machine. And to me, it's okay, if this movie really did exist, if you really could look it up on the Wayback Machine. For those who don't know, the Wayback Machine is this archiving of the internet that it goes as far back as about 1996, and it's supposed to preserve the history of the internet. If that was really the case, I feel like we would see Shazam, the alleged genie movie starring Sinbad, a lot more than we do. I feel like somebody would have downloaded it, and it would be, you'd see it on sites like Daily Motion or something, or Rumble or whatever. And I bet if you go to the Library of Congress, you will find. That's the thing I've never heard anybody talk about. Usually, I think you can find published works in the Library of Congress. So that surprises me that nobody has tried to look for that up. But really, I think what it is people want to believe that this movie exists, or I don't know. It's really silly. But I have a feeling we're at a point where the diehards, we're at a point where it's so easy to fabricate reality. I could very easily see somebody making a fake Shazam movie with just AI. Like, we're only like maybe a couple months away from saying, like, I found Shazam, it's real, I put it on YouTube, and it'll basically just be a deep fake. Oh, and then we'll have a whole other phenomena. There'll probably be several uploads of fake Shazam movies claiming to be the real one. And then those will probably get taken down, and it'll just be a thing of like, see, Sinbad wanted it suppressed all this time. And it's like, there are so many terrible movies made by actors who regret their decisions. And it's like, most of them just live and let live. And they're like, yeah, that was sort of the one blight on my record. So I don't even know if Sinbad makes enough money to suppress this movie in the draconian measure that he's allegedly doing. So I don't know. You try to bring this up to the proponents of Shazam and they just ignore it and they fall back on their argument of, I remember this movie, me and my brother had it on VHS. It's a no-win battle. But speaking of preservation, I was reading an article the other day, as I often sort of just, duck into the restroom to look up an article when I'm bored. Um, of course, when it's slow and there's not much going on. It's not like there's a lunch rush and I do that. But anyway, I saw this article that was a little bit concerning for people who like retro video games, or, well, every game becomes a retro video game at some point. And there's a concerning piece of information that since 2010, about 87% of video games have not been properly preserved. I mean, 87%. Now it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, I see all the time, like, if you know anything about retro video games, it can be expensive because, and I remember like a couple years ago, I bought a Game Boy and I bought it for like $50. And a friend of mine said, like, what? It's so old. You should have been able to get it for cheaper. And I had to tell her, it's like, well, they're not making this piece of equipment anymore, so it is scarce. Like, probably have no clue how many times, people will get a piece of tech, a Game Boy, play it, and then they'll sell it. And then the next person, they wind up paying more for it. It's even more rare when you have video game communities are dedicated to systems that, for whatever reason, never took off that well or did very good. Like, say, the Panasonic 3DO, that did abysmal. Or like this Atari Jaguar, also didn't do that great. Or like the scarcity of a game. There's a Mega Man video game for, or like the scarcity of a game. There's a Mega Man video game for, or like the scarcity of a game. There's a Mega Man video game for Game Boy, and it's like exceptionally good, and it can drive a pretty penny. I think one person has paid as much as $500 for it. I remember one person, I was at a retro video game shop, and I was talking to the guy about how he had a copy, and this one person came in, they badgered him to buy it because it went beyond having it pristine mint condition. It was unopened, still sealed. The dude even had the receipt from Toys R Us where he bought it from. And I guess eventually the dude threw a number at him he couldn't say no to. And then a friend of his said, "Hey, did you sell that game?" And he's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, I was over at this convention and I saw this guy selling it." And yeah, I think the only reason he caved to the guy might have been partially the money, but also like the dude seemed really enthusiastic about it. And I think he was more disappointed that the game didn't mean as much to him as he had been led to believe. But yeah, it's like video game preservation and movie preservation are, it's funny, they're different, but they're sort of the same. Um, I remember Martin Scorsese saying that most of the films, like the majority of them made before the 1950s, are lost to time. And that's kind of crazy. And they started to address that effort. And say what you will about Martin Scorsese, but the one thing you can argue is he has led a solid effort in trying to preserve the history of film and the movies that matter. And even if he's not preserving the films that he thinks matter, the mere fact that such there is such a Herculean effort in film preservation that if you found a film which you believe deserved preserving, there's that infrastructure already set up. But anyway, video games, it's such a... I think it is different in the fact that as time goes by, it becomes much, much more of a labor of love to preserve the technology, to preserve the games. It isn't just a thing of like, oh, click, download this. Because technology changes so much, and the further you get away from like the initial release date, the further away it becomes, the level of difficulty in preserving the game and having technology that can to interact with the old tech, it gets harder. I probably butchered that sentence, but like, okay, great example. Say you've got an old, going back to the movie analogy, say you've got an old movie on VHS. Let's say it's 2004. It would be very easy to preserve that movie because at this point, home editing software is just becoming a thing. And there's still a lot of people who have analog cameras, basically cameras that don't necessarily transfer through fire wires, but that use the red, yellow, and white wires to transfer old analog stuff. So because there's enough analog stuff being produced, it's not so difficult. And VHS is still, although it's sort of on its way out, there's still a presence there that facilitates the production of that technology that would allow you to easily transfer. Now let's go to 2010. So VCRs and analog stuff are still probably kind of difficult to find. I mean, at this point, I think you can still go into Dollar General or Walgreens and you'll still find blank VHS sold. So not as easy, but still not too crazy. Fast forward to 2016, and the last known plant of VCR manufacturers in Japan announces that it is ceasing operations because the parts are getting harder to find and the demand has fallen below 100 million a year. So basically, there will be no more new VCRs, and the ones that exist, you have to consider like, okay, wear and tear is going to be happen, and because they're not producing new parts, you don't have as much to work with. And HDMI cables have been around for a while. They've slowly gained dominance, and there isn't as much of a need to produce the old cables like you used to. Now, with computers and video games, let me put into perspective the technological evolution. So, in 1983, the NES, okay, an even better example, 1976, the Atari 2600 comes out. And if you know what that looks like, you know it's basically solid colors, like one color per character or object or background, very primitive. Now just jump 5 years later, and 5 or 7 years later, and you've got the NES, and that's significant. Like, it looks way more like a drawing. Maybe it sort of looks like something created in Microsoft Paint, but still a major hurdle over what was capable in the Atari. Now let's do something even crazier. So 1983, the NES comes out in Japan as the Famicom, and it gets released in 1985 in the US as the NES. So that's sort of the classic 8-bit era look. It's only 10 years later, roughly, that you get the PlayStation and the N64. So in 10 years' time, you go from pixels to polygons. It's a huge leap forward, but there's not a whole lot of time. Very quickly, like, video games evolved. And there's like an even greater leap between, say, the PlayStation 1 and the PS2. I believe the PlayStation had about 2 megabytes, 2 or 4 megabytes of RAM. And let's see. And I think that the PS2 had something like 32. Dang. So the PS1 had like 2 or 4 megabytes of RAM, and the PS2, PlayStation 2, had 32 megabytes of RAM. So that's like, it increased by like 8 times. So it's like there's this hurdle that video games has that films just don't. Gosh, I've already gone to almost 30 minutes. And I feel like I don't want to say enemy, but the great hurdle towards video game preservation is the video game companies themselves. Because it's one of those things where it's like there's a strong and fervent homebrew or independent community that's dedicated towards preserving games, and they have the will to do it. Not, I mean, they have the technology to. Like, I am so impressed. Like, all it takes is these homebrew guys, and video games are preserved. Like, they will create technology that allows you to interact with the old tech, which is so impressive. Like, one thing I saw recently was, I wish I remembered who they were, but there's this company that creates an interface for creating a device that you can put your Game Boy or Game Boy Advance game in, and you can read the data, and as long as you have an emulator, you can play it. And so far, they haven't come against any legal trouble. I know recently Steam, they were going to have a video game. They're going to have an emulator for, I believe, the GameCube and the Wii, but Nintendo shut that down. So one of the things is video game companies, they'll often sit on this thing of like, well, we might want to re-release it and that would hurt our sales. And it's like, okay. But at the same time, sometimes they're not releasing these games that they're saying like, oh, we're going to release it. I feel like it really just isn't much of a priority. And as much as I love Nintendo, I feel like they're so guilty of that they don't preserve their games well. I think a recent example would be the closure of the DS and 3DS and Wii shop sites. Like, especially the 3DS or the DS, like, what with updates to video games being so prevalent this day and age, it doesn't seem unreasonable that you could just release a patch for the game that transfers its playability over to, say, the Switch or something. But it feels like they're very stubborn on this. To Nintendo's credit, I will say, during the DS's lifetime, they released a lot of their legacy titles, like their Game Boy stuff, on the DS, and they've just started to make those games available on the Switch, which was something I was talking about. It would just be great if, like, like, here's a solution. Nintendo could just sell the tech yourself for these game preservations, because there's like a market for that. And if you find that it isn't like financially viable to do that yourself, then just let the homebrew crew do their thing. Because eventually this old tech is going to get so old that eventually it's going to break apart. It will fail. And I normally don't like, people who violate. I believe that people prefer a legal way over, an illegal method. And And I'm conflicted because it's like the video game companies, if they're not going to take the effort themselves to preserve video games, how can you not expect preservationists to take not legal methods in preserving like the history of video games? Because video games are art. They're something that people make. It takes people coming up with ideas and they make it. So I believe that constitutes it as art. And one of my favorite, and I talk about the Game Boy a lot because that was a system that I had, but one of the things that impresses me to no end, and I feel I've said this before, is the original Game Boy had like 4 colors to work with. It had 4 shades of gray, and I really don't think it gets enough credit as like a marvel in design. But anyway, I kind of feel like we're starting to see the beginning of kind of like how in the late 80s and early 90s we started to see film preservation efforts. I think the 2020s is the beginning of video game preservation. Because there's so many videos on YouTube about old tech and electronics. Hopefully we don't lose any games to time. Well, anyway, this has been an episode of the David Wells Experiment. I am your host, David Wells, and as I always say, have an absolutely super day. Bye.